On today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, we are continuing our 2023 training camp preview today with the wide receiver and tight end positions. All that and more on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to a Tuesday edition of the show. Shout out to our everydayers for making us your first listen Monday through Friday right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Louis DiBiase, joined as always by Gino Camilleri. Gino, today we're talking wide receiver and tight end as we continue our positional previews. Training camp is officially 1 week away. Players report next Tuesday at NovaCare Complex. And when it comes to these two spots, at least at the top, I mean, we haven't had questions about tight end in a long time, at least when it comes to tight end one. We'll get into the depth. There's questions, I think, at both of these pass-catching positions when it comes to, who follows the big three of A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, and Dallas Goedert. But, when it comes to receivers specifically, this is the first time since, 2017, where I have little to no questions about wide receiver. We mentioned this about quarterback last Friday. I feel the same way about receiver. Even last year, of course, I said A.J. Brown and DeVonta were the best duo in the league at receiver in August. But you never know even then how, a new player is going to transition to a new team. There were question marks about Jalen Hurts and how effectively they were going to throw the football. Could A.J. Brown stay healthy? What does DeVonta look like in year two? There at least were some questions. This year, I've got none, man. I mean, those two last year were so incredible. It goes without saying when you look at the numbers, their playoff performances. But the funny thing is, they both had monster games, but there weren't really games that either one took off. I was looking at the game logs. Even the games where A.J. Brown blew up or DeVonta Smith blew up, the other one was still going for 5 for 70 and a touchdown. I mean, those two are in a class of their own, and I think it's the best duo this franchise has ever seen at this position.
I think you have to go even farther back than 2017 because even going into 2017, you have the question of can Torrey Smith, who was arguably one of the least effective wide receivers in all of football, I believe he was 108 out of 108 in terms of EPA or PFF the year before. And then can Nelson Aguilar turn it around from somebody who was considered a bust? And
so
those questions
2012 then? I guess the last
you
time you had a healthy Jackson and Macklin together?
100%, man. And even with the Jason Avant in there, I think that's the best big three that you've had in quite some time. And the question is right now, you have your two stars in terms of the wide receiver position. You have your big three adding Dallas Goedert there. How are you going to find your role players? How are you going to find the J.R. Smiths, the Jamal Crawfords, those guys that are going to come off the bench in big moments for you and not let you down like Quez Watkins did last year? Because if you go back to that 2012 team, Lou, everybody who thinks Jason Avant knows how reliable he was. His hands were some of the best that this franchise has ever seen. And that's what you need as a third receiver. Somebody that you can rely on, that when they are targeted in 40 to 50 targets or so, that they're going to catch around 95% of them. And that's what Avant was. Last year, Quez Watkins, there were so many question marks. Can Olamide Zaccheaus challenge him? Can you get something in the passing game out of Dan Arnold or let's say Grant Calcaterra or even a little bit more from Jack Stoll? Or can one of the many guys on the back end of the wide receiver position step up and challenge those guys? Yeah. And it's a very interesting team building discussion, and it's the closest you're going to get in terms of truly building a basketball team outside of those top three guys.
Well, and that's the way I look at it, when it comes to that third receiver and just all those pass catchers behind the big three of Brown, Smith, and Goedert. It's like a bench shooter. Yet you're not going to, even Jason Avant. Jason Avant's a great example because of how good his hands were. He was always in the right spot. His number was not nearly called upon as much as Deshaun Jackson and Jeremy Macklin, but he was a good route runner. He was always there if a quarterback needed him. His numbers way more lucrative than I actually thought. When you look at Jason Avant, he was consistently over 50 receptions and over 500 receiving yards. I don't expect Zaccheaus to get there. I don't expect Quez Watkins to get to those numbers this year, but like Avant, like a bench shooter, when your number is called the one or two times a game where it actually is, you need that guy to step up. you need the efficiency when there isn't always the quantity. And that's tough for sure. I mean, I totally get, when these guys aren't consistently seeing the passes they, I'm sure, are used to in college or with other teams, or, for Quez, for instance, that was 2021. He was wide receiver too. I'm sure it was an adjustment last year. But regardless, you have to stay sharp when your number is called upon. And last year, simply put, as disappointing as it was, there were a couple games where Watkins stepped up, i.e. the Colts and Packers games. But outside of that, most of the time when they needed him, he really wasn't available. And this year, I'd expect he's going to bounce back between him and Zaccheaus. Gino, I think you're not going to get an increase in volume at that spot, but I think you will. I hope that you get an increase in efficiency compared to what you had last year with Watkins and Pascal.
When you go back to talking about Jason Avant, the one thing outside of his hands that you could always rely on was that he was going to be in the right spot, because he did his job regardless of assignment, regardless if it's in the run game, regardless if it's in the pass game. He's going to do it 100%. He was a great runner, like you just said. What was
Brandon
Quez
Marshall,
Watkins?
Actually, Gino, Brandon Marshall on his podcast once said that they asked who a random receiver was that he studied on film, and he actually said Jason Avant, which is interesting.
And what was a big question mark with Quez last year? Why was he stopping his routes halfway through running them? And if you look at that Super Bowl drop, if he just kept up his speed and never geared down, he's going to be wide open and probably
he doesn't have to dive.
In the end
he doesn't
zone.
have to lay out for it. Yeah.
And coming off of an NBA Finals where you look at two teams that had a great collection of role players, especially the Miami Heat. You're looking at guys like Max Struss, and you're saying when this guy gets the ball, he's a nobody, but he puts it in the basket. That's what you need out of your third.
Gabe Vincent. Yeah.
Exactly. Gabe, these guys that are like creative players on 2K or Madden, but you ultimately have to step up in those big moments. And I always will continue to say the money is in the crumbs, because when it comes down to it, and it's good on good. And that's what the Super Bowl was last year, right, Lou? When Kansas City's outside corners are doing a great job taking away your number one and your number two threat. Well, when you have a matchup with your number three, you have to take a chance. And if you don't step up and get it, well, you miss a 3-pointer that might ultimately cost you a game, which might ultimately cost you a title.
No, for sure.
And it did.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Gino. Is this a make or break position, or the spot wide receiver 3? Not necessarily, or tight end 2, but you're right. There was a moment in a championship game late in the fourth quarter where you did need that player. And so, there's going to be times I just keep making an NBA reference here because it just makes a lot of sense for this discussion when it comes to role players. The Miami Heat go all the way back to 2013, the NBA Finals, or 2014, whatever year it was, against the San Antonio Spurs. They needed Ray Allen to hit that corner 3 to save the game and save the big 3. So there's times you're going to need Quez Watkins. Are you going to need him a ton? No, for sure. Are you going to need Olamide Zaccheaus as much as Brown, Smith, and Goedert? Of course not. But there will be times you need them. I am more confident that this year you're going to get a better return from that position than last year for sure. When it comes to, and Gino, I think we know those are your top 4 guys. I don't think Quez Watkins gets cut. I can't foresee a trade really either at this point. I think
we'll see.
Maybe. Depends on it, unless you can get a safety or corner or safety or linebacker. But I think, Nick Sirianni was saying how improved he looked in OTAs. So I think they want to give Quez another chance. Zaccheaus as well. Those are your top 4 receivers. Then I think there's probably only one spot. I can't imagine they keep 6 looking at this roster. And right now, Britton Covey, because of the return experience from last year, he's got the upper hand. But it'd be really interesting to see if Devin Allen in year 2 can push him now that he might have the game speed down, returning from football last year after years of being in track. There's Joseph Nagata as well from Clemson, the undrafted kid. Jaden Hasselwood from Oklahoma, former teammate of Jalen Hurts. But I don't know, man. I mean, behind Covey, there's not a whole lot that excites me here. I think at receiver, your top 5 are probably set.
Unlike corner, where you're saying, man, there's 6, 7, 8 guys that are really promising.
Yeah.
On the back end of wide receiver, you're saying, hopefully you can find somebody to challenge Britton Covey. Yeah. But where is that shine? Where is that promise? I mean, you go down the list, right?
Well, because in those receivers I mentioned, Gino, they're bigger, like Nada and Hasselwood. They're both 6'2". They're more physical. Like, they're not return options really either.
No, and it's going to probably come down to Tyree Cleveland, who's been on a 53-man roster, who's on the back end. Greg Ward, you still have in there as well. Charleston Rambo is coming off of a very good XFL season, former teammate of Jalen Hurts. You hope that one of these guys can press the issue with Britton Covey because you don't want to settle. And part of winning in the margins is not settling. And let's say not one of these guys wins a job. Hopefully they do. The Eagles are going to try and find a guy on the waiver wire, if not. But you have to come in as that 5th or 6th guy, just like we were talking about at running back yesterday, and just like we'll talk about at corner and safety, as a special teams threat, somebody that could potentially be a gunner on the outside, and somebody that presents promise. With Devin Allen, like you said, is he ever going to be a football player, or is he just a pure track star? Charleston Rambo, is he anything more than just an XFL guy? These UDFAs, can they get to a 53-man level? Is Greg Ward more than just the 5th guy? He's still hanging around. And hopefully one of them can come out, because I will look at this battle, and you have Marcus Mariota probably throwing them a majority of the passes in the preseason. Who's going to step up at that spot? Because they're going to have to find a way to try and be a Paul Turner. Try and be that guy that makes you say, we can't cut you. We cannot leave you off the roster. Because Britton Covey, did he really make you feel that way last year, Lou? To me, as much as I love the kid out of Utah and his special teams ability, I don't know if he really felt in a great place coming into the season.
No. And his return numbers, actually I looked into, were much better than I actually thought. But there wasn't enough. Yeah, down the stretch, you look at the Titans game, I think really stood out. The Super Bowl, he actually had a big return. There just weren't enough splash plays where, Covey, there was actually like a running joke on Eagles Twitter all year where it's like every time he gets hit, it looks like he just gets annihilated because he just really couldn't shake guys. And so, yeah, I mean, you do feel like maybe there's a little meat left in the bones there, but I don't know who's going to take it behind him right now. But I will say, Gino, it's really nice to... I don't want to say not care, but be pretty at peace with this position, because the first 5 years that me and you've been doing the show together, that has not been the case. And that is absolutely the case right now at wide receiver for the Eagles. So that's definitely exciting. When it comes to tight end, we're feeling the same way about Dallas Goedert. Who's going to be behind Goedert, though, in 12 personnel? Who's stepping up at tight end, too? We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. And, guys, today's show is sponsored by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you're going to land $200 back in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit that first home run on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You can also bet on everything else in the world of sports. I'm getting ready to make some NFL futures bets coming up here this month. So sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get up to $200 back in bonus bets. It's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Eagles fans, we are continuing on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Shout out to the everydayers for making us your first listen Monday through Friday. Today, we are continuing our training camp positional previews with wide receiver and tight end. And Gino, tight end is, I would say, pretty much the same theme as receiver. We know what we got with our alpha. It's Dallas Goedert, who, by the way, I don't know why it is. I think everybody agrees when it comes to the top tier of tight ends. It's Travis Kelce. It's George Kittle and Dallas Goedert, and Mark Andrews. Those are your top 4 in whatever order that you put them. It does feel like, though, Goedert still is a little underrated as an overall weapon in football. I don't know if it's because for a few years he was the second guy behind Zach Ertz, but whatever it is, it still feels like people don't truly understand how good this guy actually is. I mean, if you even look at his numbers compared to Travis Kelce, they were actually better last year in almost every category.
I don't really care what people outside of Philadelphia
it's just interesting, though.
Dallas, because when he runs a tight end screen and he just runs through 7 guys and picks up a first down and more for the Eagles nearly every single time he runs it, it doesn't matter. And when he averages 15 yards per reception, it truly doesn't matter. And when he has this ability that Zach Ertz never really had as a yards after the catch, that was the running joke with Zach, is that this dude, He would catch a ball at 6 yards. He'd get dropped at 6 yards.
Well, and the catches in traffic too, man. I was watching back the Super Bowl highlights. I mean, that catch along the right sideline and 3rd and long with 2 guys draped all over him. Mm-hmm. Some of the one-handed catches he made. Last year, I'm telling you, if he didn't get hurt, he might have surpassed 1,000 yards too with Smith and Brown.
It's a realistic conversation to start talking about. Can they have 3 guys go over 1,000, Lou?
I could see it happening. I could see it. If he stays healthy, which is always the big if with Goedert, because he always misses at least a few games. If he plays all 17, yeah, it's going to come close.
So you're saying if they have 3 guys go over 1,000 yards, let's say total those guys go for 3,200 yards, you're saying you have to make up 800 yards in the air between the rest of your offense.
Yeah, and I'd hope you could do that between Watkins, Zaccheaus, Swift, Gainwell. You have whoever the second tight end is, you would hope so. Yeah,
you would have to hope, and that's what this discussion is all about, especially at tight end too. Behind Dallas Goedert, what are you getting? Are you getting minimal value in the pass game out of Jack Stoll and Grant Calcaterra like you had last year? I think Grant will take that leap this year. He was out of football for a bit, comes back, has some big plays in the playoffs when they needed that supplementary player. I think he is going to have a big year. I think Dan Arnold is going to be one of those guys that can be more of a slot type of receiver in big slot type of matchups, which also could present a threat to Quez Watkins' receptions and his play. Because if Dan Arnold can win those matchups in that area, not the downfield area, but in those slot alignments, what's to say that he doesn't get more reps than that third receiver? And I would like to see them press the issue there because they want to run more 12 personnel. And that's been the identity of everybody that has called plays in this Frank Reich, Doug Peterson tree, all the way down to Nick Sirianni. 12 personnel. We saw it, Lou. That's what got you to a Super Bowl with Brent Selleck, and even 13 with Trey Burton at times on top of Zach Ertz.
As a complementary piece, though, I do not want 12 to suddenly get close to where it was in 2018, 2019.
But you don't want to be pure 11 either. You want to be multiple, and that's why we're saying, like we did with the running back discussion yesterday, that you can run more 21 personnel with multiple backs, and you want more matchup-based players outside of those big 3 because I don't believe you had that last year. Dan Arnold should be that guy because he's gone close to 500 yards multiple times in his career. And who's to say he can't do that yet again, where he's not going to be the number 1 or the number 2. He's going to be the 5th, 6th, 7th passing option. But if he can do enough to help open up the game for Dallas Goedert to where teams can't simply key on him as the number 1 because you do have another receiving threat at the number 2 tight end position, that might be his biggest value add to this roster.
No, for sure. I think it's interesting when you look at those guys behind Goedert between Arnold, Calcaterra, Stoll, and then Tyree Jackson. Jack Stoll's the one I think you know the most what you have. I think, at least of the young guys. I think between him, Calcaterra, and Tyree Jackson, he's probably the lock to make the roster just because he played a lot last year. He definitely did improve as a receiver compared to where he was in 2021. Definitely a good blocking tight end. But I think when it comes to who you'd predict right now is second in receptions at tight end, it's probably Dan Arnold. You would hope, though, you almost Arnold's the most experienced player, but Gina, you almost want Calcaterra or Tyree to give you a reason to not need him. But I don't know. I know you said Calcaterra could take a step this year, and I agree for sure. I mean, he definitely showed some flashes at Oklahoma and SMU in college, but I probably would put my money on Arnold being that second guy right now.
I would agree. And beyond those guys, you have Dalton Keene, who's been around the NFL in his young career and is more of a H-back/fullback hybrid type of player. And then Brady Russell, who they signed from Colorado as a UDFA, will probably be on the practice squad. So realistically, behind Dallas Goedert, are you going to keep 3 or 4, Lou?
I don't know. I'd probably say they keep 3. I don't know if 4 guys are worth. I'm not stashing. I could stash one of Tyree Jackson or a tight end of that level I can keep on the practice squad. I don't think any of them are worth it. It's kind of like what we were talking about yesterday with running back. I'm not keeping Sermon or Kennedy Brooks as my 5th back when I can get that. If I really need that player, I can find someone of that tier.
Yeah, I trust my pro personnel department to go out and find somebody at that point. I totally agree. And it's going to be a big 3 preseason games for those guys that we're talking about. Because in the Jack Stoll discussion, Lou, would this team favor a big blocking tight end over potentially keeping a 10th offensive lineman that Jeff Stoutland is in love with.
That's a good point. I actually, you kind of changed my mind on that because I was thinking Stoll is probably the safest between him, Calcaterra, and Jackson. If Arnold looks the part of clearly the superior veteran pass catcher at tight end. But you're right, though. You could keep an extra lineman, and if you see some real flashes from Calcaterra and or Jackson, and Stoll is like still solid, but I just think that's who he's always going to be. Yeah, I guess you probably could convince me one of those two is kept instead, and I would be behind that. I mean, you got nothing to lose. Jack Stoll isn't someone I'm going to lose sleep over if he's not on this team.
It's really picking the flavor of ice cream, the Baskin-Robbins 37 flavors that you want. Do you want a Jack Stoll who can help your run game? And maybe they do.
I think, Gino, do you need help with more? The complementary
pass
receiver,
game. It has to be the pass
or
game.
Blocking with. I think the last thing this team needs help with is run blocking.
Right, so. And Jeff Stoutland's so creative in run blocking too, with how he gets everybody involved in that department. That if you're going to keep either a offensive lineman who potentially down the road you could get a 6th or 7th round pick for, or Jack Stoll, who would probably be claimed off of waivers, or even Grant Calcaterra, for example.
Yeah.
I go Dallas Goedert, Dan Arnold, and may the best man win on the other side.
Yeah,
or
I agree.
You stash one of those guys and you could play the up and down off the practice squad game, or maybe you even go out and find a guy. That's always the conversation too, is that even at the 53-man cut down, there's still another cut down that's going to come the next day once all of these teams cut down to 53. So do they even keep 2 going into the waiver wire, Lou, and maybe even have a roster spot open? So We'll see. Dan Arnold, there's not much that you invested in him, much like the running back position with Rashad Penny and DeAndre Swift. I would say out of those 3 guys, Dan Arnold is probably the least safe.
I was going to say, I don't think Arnold's I think he's, if I'm predicting right now, and if we're doing our 53-man depth chart predictions, I'm putting him on this roster.
I am too.
But yeah, Gino, I don't think it's a guarantee. If let's say, heading into camp, Calcaterra and Tyree Jackson look good, and Stoll, and suddenly all 3 of the young kids, or 2 of the 3 are looking pretty solid, and Arnold's just whatever. I think he is the favorite of the 4 to grab one of those 2 spots behind Goedert, but it's no lock at all. No. I mean, it's Dan Arnold. It's not like this is a Zach Ertz type of player. But, this is also the reality for most teams. The Eagles have had a luxury at tight end where you went, years of Zach Ertz and Brent Selleck, and even Trey Burton as a 3rd tight end is really freaking good. I mean, he became a starter look at the money he got from, I think it was Chicago that paid him after the Super Bowl in 2018.
He went to Indy for a little bit, yep.
And then Indy. And then you go to Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert. You're normally not going to have that at tight end. This is normally the reality for the NFL.
Well, I could counter that and say, look at what Buffalo's doing. You already have Knox there, and they go out and spend a high pick on another tight end that is a receiving threat. And look at what Green Bay is doing.
They don't have receivers, so they're kind of pulling a 2018,
That's true. They don't have A.J.
Eagles.
Brown and DeVonta Smith. We have to remember that as well.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when we are making that 53-man roster pick, it's going to come down to 1, what the coaching staff wants, and 2, ultimately what Howie Roseman wants, and does he want to keep his draft picks at this position and keep Calcaterra on the team over a guy like Arnold, who's just a free agent, possibly Tyree Jackson. That's his pet project. He's been on the team. Can he give you something in the passing game? This preseason, these practices between teams are going to be huge for the back end of this tight end position to really separate who can make an impact on this roster.
It's one of the biggest depth battles, even at running back. I don't know how much of a battle as we discussed yesterday. I think you look at tight end, you can say, I don't know, cornerback. I mean, there's some other spots too, but I think corner and tight end are the 2 positions you look at. There's like 3 or 4 young players that are really battling for not only a roster spot, but potentially a legitimate role as a top backup, off the bench if they need them. Gino, to wrap up the show, interesting because I think we know, again, in whatever order you think it's going to happen with, receptions and receiving yards, we know the top 3, DeVonta Smith, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert, barring an injury, knock on wood, those guys are going to lead the way on this offense. And I think you're in every game because of that big 3. Who do you think, let's say if you had to predict your top 6 wide receivers or pass catchers for the Eagles this year in terms of receiving yards, let's say we'll just throw Smith, Brown, and Goedert at the top. Who are your bottom 3 in receiving yards? Like your top 6, who rounds out that bottom?
DeAndre Swift.
Ooh, as
I think
the fourth
he can get
guy?
4A, 4B. I think he has a
Okay.
chance to really be that guy. If he can get to 500 yards, Lou, who's to say that he can't, especially if OZ and Dan Arnold and Quez are all kind of equal. Could you say those guys get, let's say OZ gets 400 yards and Quez gets 400 yards and then Arnold slightly below him, but I think they go
I don't know.
11 personnel
total.
heavy.
I would love 800 total from Watkins and Zaccheaus.
That would be an ideal situation. I don't know if it happens.
Yeah,
okay, let's say OZ gets 400, Quez gets 300. And then you have
I think you're going to be I think Watkins
prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. I like OZ. I think he's a good addition to this room.
I do too, though. I mean, OZ got what for Atlanta last year, over 500 receiving yards.
Mm-hmm.
So you think though Swift over both of them?
Dude, he's going to be a threat, man. Like, how many times is he just going to get the ball on
I hope you're
pass
right.
to the flat, and he goes for 8
because that means you add a whole new element to this offense. Yeah, no, I hope you're right. Yeah, interesting. So Swift, you'd say what? Zaccheaus and then Watkins round out the top 6?
Yeah, and then honorable mention, Dan Arnold.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I just didn't know if you maybe had in mind a Gainwell or another tight end, but I agree. I just had it in a different order. I had Watkins, Swift, and Zaccheaus, but I think Gino. The good news is like you replace Miles in the passing game last year. I think you upgraded pretty much. I think this year's Quez Watkins versus last year is going to be an upgrade. I think Zaccheaus is an upgrade over Zach Pascal, and I think Swift is an upgrade over Sanders. So when it comes to those bottom options in the passing game, I think you're going to have upgrades. And again, is it going to come in this giant new look and the numbers are crazy? No, because again, you have the volume monsters at the top. But I do think efficiency-wise, again, it's just like an NBA team. It's a guy that LeBron James is going. He's driving to the basket. He needs to kick it out. He needs his three-point shooter just to hit one shot. And that's what these guys got to be. These backup tight ends, these backup wide receivers. When Jalen Hurts calls your name the few times a game that he does, you got to step up. And honestly, last year, I think Jack Stoll might have been the most reliable of all of those like bottom tier pass catchers. When somebody's number was called and they needed to make a catch, I think that's how just ineffective Watkins and Pascal really. I mean, Pascal, I should say, made a couple nice catches on third down, but Gino, I think you need more from these role players this year, especially if you're going to throw the football more, which I think they're going to.
And with the Swift conversation, he has had 46, 62, and 48 receptions.
And he's going to have way less drops than Sanders, man. Sanders had some drops last year.
Dude, he averaged 7.8, 7.3, and 8.1 yards per carry. Can he not do that again? And then that takes so much off of the tight ends as well, because now your best cover safety or cover linebacker is going to be having to go and take on DeAndre Swift in the passing game. And that only helps Dan Arnold and potentially can help Grant Calcaterra as well. And this is the money ball approach. That's what we're talking about on these back end guys. You're going to have to make up what is a third wide receiver or a tight end two through a group effort. It's going to be a committee approach. We know that the Eagles like to shuffle guys in and out of the lineup all of the time, especially at tight end, especially at running back, and especially at the back half of wide receiver. You're going to see a lot of guys come up in moments where you look back on the season and say, oh yeah, remember when Dan Arnold had that touchdown in the fourth quarter that like kept us in this game? And why was that? It was because Dallas Goedert was being covered by one of the top guys, and so was DeVonta, and so was AJ, and Quez Watkins is stepping up, and you just have to have the role players step up. You need the Mike Millers of the world to hit their 3-point shots and win you some games.
The Shane Battiers. I don't know why we keep going back to the Heat.
Who was the guy that was always with LeBron wherever he went? He was in Cleveland.
James Jones.
James Jones. Yeah, that's what this team needs. They need to find their James Jones, that Mercedes Lewis type of player, right?
Maybe that's the guy they bring in. He's a free agent still, a tight end.
What do you say?
If nobody steps up, maybe they just bring in old man I can't believe he's still playing, but old man Mercedes Lewis. The good news, Gino, all these guys we're talking about, at least it's not 2019 where we need them to help us get into the playoffs. Seriously. So it shows just how far we've come at these positions.
Josh Perkins at this position.
No Josh Perkins, Travis Fulgham, Deontay Burnett. You know, the list goes on and on. The Eagles look pretty set up right now at both wide receiver and tight end. We'll continue our positional previews tomorrow with the offensive line, and then we'll move over to defense to round out the week. Training camp 1 week away at the NovaCare Complex. We got you covered right here on all things Philadelphia Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Locked On Eagles is always part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Shout out to our everydayers Monday through Friday. We'll see you tomorrow for a Wednesday edition of the show. Until then, follow us on Twitter as well, at LockedOnBirds, at GC24_football, and at DiBiase LOE. As always, thank you for downloading, thank you for watching and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.